which is one of the toughest outfits in the Republican Guard, is now down to 10% of its fighting strength. That means it's practically inoperative. Others are down to 50%, but there's still one or two divisions which are around 75, 80, 90% of their fighting strength, and they could still put up very stiff resistance indeed when the American forces get en masse to Baghdad itself.
Tonight, the noose appears to be tightening on Saddam Hussein. The question is how desperate he will get before he is finally toppled. Carl Dinnan, ITV News, Iraq.
Well, Mark, we and the U.S. Marines, the battalion that we're traveling with, really found ourselves in the thick of it this morning. I believe you can probably see those plumes of smoke behind me. Those are the remnants of a firefight that we got caught in the middle of along this road along the Tigris River. Now, what happened is that we were moving into a town that we had been told might be infested with members of the Iraqi army, and in fact it was. There was an ambush on our convoy just as we entered the town. The Marines, of course, are very carefully trained in exactly what to do at that moment. They pulled over, positioned their vehicles, and got out and started firing. Now, one of the young Marines who was firing his machine gun had never fired in battle before. He had only fired on a firing range. He said it was a very, very different thing, described how weak-kneed he was and how he had butterflies in his stomach. He called it an adrenaline rush from hell. Well, eventually the Marines rushed the building where most of these Iraqis were. They rounded them up. They killed some. We don't know how many. Some were injured. They were many, many dozens of EPWs, enemy prisoners of war, as they call them. And one tense moment at the end, we realized that some of that fire was coming from behind us. It turned out it was a sniper in a building within easy sight of us, about 700 or 800 yards away. They trained their fire on that building and suppressed it quite quickly. So over for now, but they expect a good deal more of this as we move closer and closer to Baghdad.
We were the last journalists to travel the airport road. The Iraqis were trying to make a point that the Americans were not poised to take it. But then, just as we reached our destination, we heard artillery. Quickly, we abandoned our car as shells landed. We were taking cover with the Iraqi army. The soldiers chatted and we waited for what seemed like an eternity. But then in a break in the barrage, we decided to get back in the car and flee. And you get... We're leaving just as quickly as we arrived. The Iraqis claim that the Americans aren't at the airport. They do seem to me to be pretty near. Minutes later, we thought it wise to get off the road once more. That's the whine of an artillery shell landing pretty close to Saddam Hussein International Airport. We've heard at least 20 loud explosions like that over the last 10 minutes or so. Here's another one. When we did finally manage to get away, we knew the ground war wasn't far behind.
Come on, Duncan. Please, Duncan. Okay.
John Irvine, ITV News, Baghdad.
Jets are pounding Iraqi troops on the road to Mosul. The Iraqis have been ordered to stand and fight after yesterday's retreat, but they are taking terrible punishment. Earlier, we advanced on foot towards Mosul, which is part of Saddam's heartland. We followed a unit of Kurdish Peshmerga through miles of territory which the Iraqi army has abandoned. With us, half a dozen US Special Forces soldiers, who for a time were hopeful that the enemy had pulled out altogether.
So what's your procedure when you get up to a place like this?
Well, usually we sneak up to it at dark in the middle of the night. But seeing how the Peshmerga pretty much secured the whole high ground here, we're just going to walk up there with them.
There's firing going on.
And they're moving.
We've just heard a shot over there.
Yeah. They get contact front, dude.
The Iraqis were a few hundred yards ahead of us, and they opened fire.
Right there. Right there.
Soldiers and journalists dived for cover and the Peshmerga rapidly began to fire back.
New situation here on the road to Mosul. Up to just a few minutes ago, we were walking calmly down the road with a few members of the US Special Forces. Then our position was fired upon. Since then, both US troops and Kurds have gone into action, as you can see behind me, taking over a former Iraqi army position and opening fire on what they believe are enemy positions further ahead.
Go again, quick.
Kurdish and American troops began to move forward towards the enemy. The Kurds fired rocket-propelled grenades towards their enemy. Iraqi troops fired back from behind a low hill, and their mortar rounds began to land nearby. We took cover.
Roger, grid 7-0.
The Americans called in airstrikes, and the jets screamed in. But tonight, the Iraqis are still holding out on the road to Mosul. Julian Mannion, ITV News, on the Northern Front.
There was more gunfire around Basra today as British troops moved inexorably towards the city centre. Snipers claimed 3 kills, hitting Iraqi artillery controllers 700 metres away. And Royal Engineers worked under fire to douse oil pipelines set ablaze by retreating Iraqi troops.
This is your country, and we don't want to take it, we want to give it back to you.
In nearby Azabaya, the commander of British forces was on a personal mission to win hearts and minds.
The reception we got here was a hail of bullet and rocket attacks. We can now come here on our feet, we talk to the people, the reception has been excellent everywhere I've been.
But at Azabaya Hospital, the prevailing mood remains one of fear and uncertainty. A mood captured by the hospital's director. Saddam Hussein is my president, he told me.
For how long do you think?
I don't know.
But until then, you'll keep his photograph?
Unless it is drawn by force.
Whereupon a British officer promptly removed the presidential portrait that adorned the director's office. British troops control the streets of Azabaya, but not yet the hearts and minds of the people. Iraqis are living with an invading army, but Saddam Hussein is still their president. For the moment, they don't know what the future will hold. As Basra burned, these fighters opted for surrender.
But they are searching for weapons or money.
Hey, stop!
Intelligence suggests locals are being paid to fight.
Anyone with a lot of money may have been given that in order that they then come down into this area and put an attack in on coalition forces.
The Gurkhas take to the skies to police thousands of square miles, nominally under British control. Swooping on suspicious vehicles, they call them Eagle checkpoints. An awesome sight. It terrifies this family of refugees. Bullet holes in the windscreen, a clue to why they are on the move. This little girl's eyes fill with fear as she watches her father and brothers being searched at gunpoint. She doesn't conceal her delight when they're free to go. One driver tells me he supports the Allies.
American?
British?
English?
Yes.
Yes, very good.
Very good. In Iraq?
Yes.
Surrounded by guns, it's hard to tell if he means it. Suddenly, Gurkhas searching a truck find a stash of banknotes. The men inside also carrying large sums of money, this what they've been looking for. Hands high, the men are led towards a helicopter and further interrogation. If their plans were sinister, then one attack at least has been prevented. Andrea Catherwood, ITV News with the Gurkha Rifles, southern Iraq.
It is now within striking distance as troops from the 3rd Infantry Division make their final thrust through the desert. Wrecked American armour by the sides of the road suggests there has been some Iraqi opposition, but by and large the Republican Guard has either been destroyed or has withdrawn, and the way seems to be open for coalition forces to close in on the city's southern limits.
We remain cautiously optimistic. We don't think that the fighting is over yet, and so there are still options available to the regime, including the use of weapons of mass destruction. We take that very seriously. We take it in a sober fashion, and at the same time we remain prepared to continue our operations.
Be very much on.
Now, you have people well forward of you because they're doing the targeting. What are you hearing from them?
We haven't had reports from as far forward as the airport itself, but what we have been getting from our forward units is that Iraqis have been staging guerrilla-style attacks on American forces. 2 men were killed today and 6 injured in an RPG attack, a rocket-propelled grenade attack, carried out by people in civilian clothes. There was also a drive-by shooting by men in a civilian car wearing civilian clothes. In both cases, the Americans returned fire and the men in question were killed very quickly. These are almost suicide missions, but I think they display something of just how desperate the Iraqis are becoming. Many of their elite units have been all but wiped out. The units of the divisions of the Republican Guard have been severely depleted at this time, so these are the sort of tactics that they're turning to. We don't know how many units of Republican Guard are in Baghdad. That could still be a tough fight.
US troops of the 1st Marine Division said to be advancing on the outskirts of Baghdad. There's no way of verifying their position, but there's no doubt they've run into opposition. Some of these soldiers are engaging in battle for the first time, at first responding to an Iraqi ambush, and then a threat from behind.
You got a sniper in the tower behind you!
Covering rounds are directed at the sniper as troops close in on the area. Eventually, the sniper fire ceases.
I don't know, I'm hoping it doesn't get any worse than this. But I just got this feeling in my gut that the further north we get, the worse it's going to get, the more contact we're going to get.
Further south, heavy artillery is readied in support of a drive said to be across the River Tigris. It's a fearsome display of firepower, though there's no way of knowing if it's successful in eliminating military targets. However, as the battalion advances, all along the roadside, the aftermath of battle recently fought. A drive-by snapshot of war.
Last night, a special operations element raided the Thar Palace on the outskirts of Baghdad.
Away from the front line, US commanders in Qatar brief on what they say was a successful special operations raid. The palace, 50 miles from Baghdad, was said to be used by Saddam and his son.
They did take fire on entry from anti-aircraft artillery. The helicopter was put down on the ground. An aerial gunship provided some support as required. Entering into the building that was just blown open.
The pictures show the special forces storming the building. But what about the Iraqi leadership?
The raid did not yield any regime leaders in this case, but documents were taken that will be valuable for intelligence. And this illustrates the ability of this coalition to operate anywhere against any regime target.
But Iraq is claiming its successes too, saying it shot down an F-18 fighter jet, seen here, and a Black Hawk helicopter. US officials confirmed the loss of the F-18 near Karbala, the first fighter jet to be shot down in the war. There's no word on the fate of the pilot. At the holy city of Najaf, US soldiers are reported to have moved into the centre, still said to be meeting some resistance. However, a leading local Shiite leader has reportedly urged Iraqis not to impede the invasion, though there's no way of knowing if that's true or if such a call is being heeded. Either way, there are no such voices emerging on the road to Baghdad as British and American forces close in.
Baghdad by night. A series of bombs fall on a military storage facility shortly after midnight. Baghdad by day, Oil fires obscure the sky over a city which is home to 6 million people. They're used to bombs and missiles now, but what if the fighting comes here? The information minister says the Americans can't do it.
They are not even 100 miles or whatever. They are not in any place. They are on the move everywhere. They are a snake moving in the desert. They hold no place in Iraq. This is an illusion.
But everyone's heard the rumours that the Americans are closing in. The streets are pretty quiet, but what can you do? You have to eat and earn money. If the city's besieged, it'll be impossible to get fresh produce from the countryside. It's already hard.
In normal circumstances, tomatoes are very cheap, 100 dinars or less. But British and American forces have landed in the area around Basra and Najaf, where most of Iraq's tomatoes come from, so they're difficult to get, and the price has shot up to 700, 750 dinars.
The baker's got enough flour to keep going for a month. But what if the water goes off, as it has in Basra? People thought the bombardment was going to be much worse than it has been. Now they don't know whether to believe the Americans are really coming to the city.
We'll keep going. Whether the Americans come or not, we'll keep working. These are our people. We need to defend them and make bread for them.
Iraqi government installations are being destroyed every day. But the regime says it has the high moral and diplomatic ground. With the invaders on the doorstep, will that help in the end?
All countries, all free governments of the world support Iraq. Only puppet governments, those who receive their briberies from America and Britain, are with the aggression. And there are very few, but all these honest and free governments all over the world are against this aggression, because this aggression is a threat to humanity, a threat to the United Nations, a threat to all civilized thinking in the world.
There's no panic here. The defenders of Baghdad are as prepared as they'll ever be, watching and waiting.
Southern Iraq, and travelled with them earlier today. Alex.
Hello, John. Yes, indeed I did. But before I talk about that, just very briefly, the controversy here today has been over cluster bombs. At first, the senior briefer here said in Kuwait City that the British Army did not use any such munitions, either from the air or from ground artillery, only to be overruled by his second-in-command, who's living with us here, who said, well, actually we are. We're using an L-20 munition, which can fire a bomb which then releases some 66 bomblets in an area of a 50-yard radius or so. He stresses they only do that on what are definitely military targets, but the military target at the moment is the built-up area of Basra, so we shall judge when and if we enter the city. But as you say, first of all, I spent much of the day following that operation which took the British into their deepest foothold in the city to date. Shell flares light up Basra by night. The army has belatedly admitted that it is using cluster bombs on this city, but it insists only on purely military targets. But do such things still exist in this war, especially in Basra? In the pre-dawn gloom, soldiers are briefed. They're about to attack and seize Britain's first real foothold in Basra itself. At first light, they advance cautiously, replying to Iraqi mortars and small arms fire. One of two such pushes across the bridges to the west of the city into the town. Helicopters quartered the ground, shadowing. By mid-morning, the Challenger tanks were moving into the building which we'd seen being shelled only yesterday. It turned out to be the technical college. Saddam's portrait still intact. The rest of the campus laid waste by the British Army. There was at least one Iraqi casualty, but British officers said most of the Iraqis had retreated into the city to what had been their observation position. So it is that this building behind me, only being shelled yesterday, is now taken as a lodgement, as the army call it, a foothold on the edge of Basra itself, one of the very first. It's exactly the process we saw happening in Azubaya down the road to the south. It is not siege warfare, it's not frontal assault, it's a gradual, patient taking over of areas of the city. The chemistry classroom, abandoned by the Fedayeen militia, now a British observation post. Snipers on the rooftops of what is one of the very first British positions now in Basra itself.
Yeah, I suppose that's absolutely true. We have the factory complex this side, and we have troops on the southern side here as well. But as I say, we can now start to bring pressure to bear.
Well, the army's now saying we've got to get out of here because there is still a mortar threat from the Iraqis, who are still not too far away defending the southern outskirts of Basra. An indication perhaps that although this has been a limited success, it is still just a foothold on Basra itself.
And at the entrance to the college, a British tractor and Saddam Hussein. Wherever you look in Iraq, evidence of how Britain sustained the dictator she now attacks. Way to the south of Basra, you can see the oil fires which mark the city on the skyline. Today, around its fringes, army engineers were attempting to put out the fires used by the militia to smokescreen their city's defences. Not far away, burst pipes of a different sort, but this water, they said, was no good for drinking, just washing.
This is your country.
Today, the general officer commanding was putting over the coalition message to the people of Azubaya.
And we don't want to take it, we want to give it back to you.
But are people getting the message? Do they want to get it? Look at the fear and the suspicion in Dr. Abdul Hussein's eyes, the doctor at Azerbai's hospital.
How long will you keep the photograph of President Saddam up there?
He's my president.
Still your president?
Still.
For how long do you think?
I don't know.
But until then, you will keep his photograph?
Unless it is drawn by force.
Do you still support him?
I support the hospital.
Then, as Dr. Hussein looked on, a soldier removed the photo of Saddam Hussein.
Yes, you can.
A soldier from the British Army, which the doctor said had recently killed 60 civilians and seriously injured 260 other people in recent fighting here.